Well, welcome everyone. My name is Doug Dahman. I'm the Curator of Education at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I want to thank you for tuning in to the April edition of our Second Friday lecture. As always, the Second Friday lecture comes to us in sponsorship with the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable and Iron Brigade Association. We thank them for their continued support of not only the Second Friday lecture series, but all of our public programming at the Civil War Museum. With us today is Eric Hemenway. Eric is going to talk to us about Company K, 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. Eric is an Anishinaabe Odawa from Cross Village, Michigan. He's the Director of Repatriation, Archives, and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indian, a federally recognized tribe in northern Michigan. Eric works to collect and preserve historical information for LTBB Ottawa. That information is used to support the LTBB government and create educational materials on Odawa history, such as exhibits, signage, publications, presentations, curriculums, and media. Eric has also worked on numerous repatriations of Native human remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. He is a former member of the NAGPRA Review Committee and currently sits on boards for the Michigan Historical Commission, Michigan Historical Society, Michigan Humanities Council, and Little Traverse Conservancy. Eric, thank you so much for agreeing to join us on this day and to present on the topic of the Anishnaabek of Company K. And also, I should mention before you get going, Eric also helped us with our exhibit that's currently opening up on our second floor of the museum on immigrants who served in the Union Army during the Civil War. So Eric, again, thank you so much for joining us. And we're really pleased to have you present on this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. And I appreciate the opportunity to tell one of my favorite stories. I always say this when I give a talk, this is one of my favorite stories, but Company K is really one of my favorite stories, a fascinating story. And I'm always looking forward to partnering with other Civil War museums and groups to get this information out there. So I appreciate sharing the space, not just in the museum itself, but in telling the story today. And Company K is something that hits close to home for me, as we'll see in a little bit here, being from Cross Village. And this is one of the stories that once people hear it, they ask, why isn't this a movie or a novel or a miniseries? It's that good. And I promise you, once you hear it, you'll ask that yourself. So without further ado, we'll get into the story of the Anishnaabek of Company K. And this was the Union Army's largest all-Indian regiment east of the Mississippi River. So first off, who was Company K? Company K was comprised of Odawa, also known as Ottawa, Ojibway, also known as Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes. Collectively together, we are the Anishnaabek, and these are who made up Company K. It was 139 Anishnaabek soldiers in Company K, and 43 died from diseases or wounds. So comparatively speaking, for other mortality rates from other regiments and groups from the Civil War, Company K had a relatively high survival rate. 51% of Company K was Odawa, 36 were Ojibway, 8% Potawatomi, and 5% were unknown. And with the unknown, I am assuming that it was just people who could not read what tribe was given, or they did not take down what tribe. So, but it was 100% Native, it was 100% Anishnaabek. And Company K was part of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, and they're primarily from the lower peninsula of Michigan. So I'm very lucky with working here at Little Traverse Bay Bands. We have a GIS department, so I asked them very nicely, can you make us a map if I give you the data? And they do. So this is a custom-made map that we had to show exactly where all the men from Company K were from. You can see it's from the entire state, but primarily it's the lower peninsula. We have a few men from up in the upper peninsula of Greenland, Marquette, Sault Ste. Marie, very small numbers, but primarily it's the lower peninsula. And the areas that are from the northern lower peninsula that are highlighted are the Little Traverse and Grand Traverse reservations. And you can see also in the middle of the state, Isabella, Saginaw, Ionia, men were joining from Company K, Pentwater, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Detroit. We do have one individual from Canada at Wapu Island, and you can see where that is over by Detroit. So men from all over the state were joining Company K, but they were coming from large clusters of Odawa communities in the northern lower peninsula, and also from the central part of the northern lower at Isabella and Saginaw. But the story of Company K isn't just about the Civil War years itself. It's about the years leading up to the Civil War and what the Anishnaabek were going through or have gone through up until that point. And the Anishnaabek had actually fought against the Americans in 3 wars: the Revolutionary War, Little Turtles War, also known as the Old Northwest War from 1790 to 1794, and the War of 1812. So there wasn't a lot of good blood between the United States and the Odawa leading up to the Civil War. There's been a lot of hostilities between the tribe and the United States over land, resources, infringement on way of life. So this is how the Odawa met the United States, was through warfare and continual warfare. It wasn't just one war, but 3 separate wars. And post-war of 1812, when the tribes can no longer take up arms to protect their rights and their lands, they had to get into agreements that we call treaties. And the United States and the Odawa engaged in several treaties, the major ones being the Treaty of 1821, 1836, and 1855. The Treaty of 1836 was the Washington, D.C. Treaty, and the Treaty of 1855 was the Treaty of Detroit. These are 2 major treaties that helped create the state of Michigan, as we'll see in a moment. But also there was removal, and removal was not just for the Cherokees out of Georgia that we learned so much in our public school system, but it was targeted for all tribes, primarily east of the Mississippi. Removal did occur out west. There were some tribes that were removed from California and Oregon, but the primary focus was tribes east of the Mississippi, and this was under the Indian Removal Act that was signed by Andrew Jackson in 1830. And the Odawa were seriously threatened with removal out of Michigan in 1838 and between 1840. There was Odawa communities in northern Ohio that were removed, and they're in Oklahoma, and removal was going through Michigan, southern Michigan, near Battle Creek and Kalamazoo in 1838 and 1840. So this was something that was a real threat to the tribes in Michigan. It was removing Potawatomis from southwestern Michigan, and the Odawa in the north were seeing this happen to their kin. And this is on the doorstep to the Civil War. In Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, all those tribes were vacated under these removal policies. So again, this is the Union, this is the federal government that is enacting these policies. And this leads up to the question of why would the tribes fight for this government that was actively working against them and removing them from their ancestral homelands. And there was also social and civil rights of the Anishinaabe were being diminished leading up to the Civil War, in particular to access to natural resources. We had loss of lands, we had loss of access to food, access to hunting, access to fishing, and there was drastic changes in Anishinaabe life. Leading up to the Civil War in the first half of the 19th century, there was civilization policies that were created by the federal government, and they were targeted on all tribes throughout the country. And these civilization policies were to change the very nature of the native populations to make them into their white settler neighbors. So religion, how they dressed, how they lived in their homes, how they hunted, how they fished, how they grew, their clothing, appearance, everything was targeted for change under these civilization policies, including removal. And part of the argument during the time was that the natives just could not become civilized unless they were removed from close proximity of their white neighbors. So there's a lot of different reasoning and excuses for Indian removal. And one of those was that we had to be civilized. So these are all of the moving parts that are leading up to the Civil War. And this whole idea that the Indians, the natives, the tribes couldn't take care of themselves was from the top down. This is a very popular cartoon, a political cartoon of Andrew Jackson during the 1830s. And it just shows that the Indians, the tribes, are children, and they're looking up to the president as that we often refer to as the Great Father, the father, to take care of them. Again, this is this portrayal that natives were incapable of taking care of themselves. And natives were absolutely capable of taking care of themselves. They've been doing this for thousands of years. But it's this idea that we had to look up to the federal government to have our day-to-day handlings handled by somebody else. And this is all part of the environment, political and social, leading up to the Civil War, that creates a lot of discussion of why did the men from Company K join. And this is what we call the Royce Maps. And this is all of the different treaties that were created to help create Michigan, essentially. And so these different colored areas represent different treaties that different tribes agreed to. So we have these certain colored sections. So this is the Treaty of Detroit, 1807. This is the Treaty of Saginaw, 1819. This is the Treaty of Chicago, 1821. This is the Treaty of Washington, D.C., 1836, and the Treaty of La Pointe, 1842. So you can see that there's massive chunks of land that are being ceded to the federal government with each treaty. And essentially, this is how Michigan becomes Michigan. The federal government has to engage in these government-to-government agreements called treaties in order to legally obtain the land for settlers, natural resource development, so on and so forth. So all these different states throughout the Union have these different Royce maps to show the different treaties that were signed by these different tribes or groups of tribes at certain periods. So this is the Treaty of 1836 of Washington, D.C. It's the largest land cession treaty for Michigan. It cedes over 14 million acres to the federal government from the tribes who signed it. And those tribes are Little Travers, Grand Travers, Muskegon, Grand River, Mackinac, and Sault Ste. Marie. And these are primarily Odawa tribes who signed this one treaty. And different tribes signed different treaties. So for the Saginaw, 1819 is primarily Ojibways or Chippewas. And down in the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, a lot of Potawatomi, some Odawas, but 1836 Washington, D.C. is primarily Odawa. And they cede this massive chunk of land in 1836. And the subsequent year in 1837, Michigan moves from a territory and it obtains statehood. So it needed this treaty in order to take that next step in order to become a state. So these are major agreements that have large implications, not just on the tribal communities, but the state communities and also the federal government. And men from Company K, their fathers and uncles were signatories to this treaty of 1836 that helped set up Michigan. But in the same time, you see this massive loss of land that the tribes had to endure in order to stay home. Because if you don't sign the treaties, the alternative is removal, either forced removal by the army or voluntary removal, because we were targeted to removal out to Kansas, and a lot of, well, the vast majority of tribal people in Michigan did not want to relocate to basically an alien environment, did not have water, and did not have the trees and just the means that we have been accustomed to thrive. So this is the follow-up of the Royce map. And this is all the small, what we call reservations or reserves that the tribes in Michigan negotiated to have for themselves to avoid removal. So we'll go back real quickly, and you can see that in these large sections of land, the tribes had basically free reign. They could move around to utilize resources, natural and cultural, and within one generation, they're restricted to these small reservations. And these colored areas are the small reserves that the tribes negotiated to keep for themselves in order to avoid removal out to Kansas and Oklahoma. And when you were removed, you essentially had to walk out west, and many times it was a death march or a death sentence. Large numbers of people died on these removal marches. And the Potawatomi of northern Indiana and southern Michigan were removed, and they had what they called the Trail of Death in 1838, where over 30 individuals out of 180 died, mainly children, because they just couldn't hold up to the elements and the sickness and exposure of being out and moving in November and December. So removal was life-threatening, and you avoided it at all costs. And so the tribes negotiated these treaties and these reservations to avoid this. And this is all leading up to the Civil War. So we had a struggle for equality in leading up to the Civil War. In 1861, the Odawa and Ojibway were denied entry into the Union Army. And there was a lot of mistrust, a lot of hardships that were carrying over from the War of 1812 and all the frontier violence that would have occurred at that time. But we were finally allowed to muster in 1863 after heavy losses on both sides, and the Union essentially needed manpower. And the Odawa and Ojibway and Potawatomi kept trying to join, and they were denied, but finally were entered in 1863. And also with the struggle for equality, tribes were trying to renegotiate new treaties. The treaty process was an imperfect process, to say the least. A lot of these treaties were agreed to under duress. So for example, with the 1836 treaty, there was the backdrop of removal. If you didn't agree to it, then you would be moved out. So there was a very, very high level of pressure to get into this negotiation. And after you negotiate, you work to stay home, which would be the 1855 treaty that removed the threat of removal. But then again, this was another imperfect agreement, and the tribes were trying to renegotiate for new treaties for stronger rights to land and to natural resources. And also at this time, natives were not US citizens. You could become a US citizen if you're a native, but there was with stipulations. One, in the state of Michigan, you had to prove that you were civilized. And I still don't know the matrix or the test for this, but this was in our 1850 Constitution of Michigan, that you could become a state citizen if you could prove that you were civilized. For federal citizenship, you could obtain that if you joined the military, or if you were a native female and you married a white male, you could obtain citizenship. But on both accounts, whether you joined the military or you married outside of the tribe, you had to renounce your tribal citizenship. And this was something that a lot of natives were just unwilling to do at the time. And again, there was restrictions on hunting, fishing, and gathering, which were very detrimental at the time, because a lot of native people were still relying on their traditional means to feed their families. So why did they fight? This is one of the million-dollar questions for Company K and all natives in the Civil War, because there was this question that was overarching. Public opinion was not favorable of Indians at this time whatsoever. They were being disenfranchised from their lands. They were being removed. They were having their lands encroached upon by settlers and squatters. And then the question was, this is not an Indian fight. You know, the North and the South, the United States itself was tearing itself apart. And some native communities said, this isn't our fight. We'll just step back and let this play out. It just seems as if the United States had this insatiable appetite for war. They go against, other tribes. They go against each other. They go against the British. So this isn't our fight. We're going to wait this one out. But then there's also the history of warriors. A lot of tribal people wanted to prove themselves through going on the war path and going into battle. But then there's also monetary gains to be had from this. And this was, even though there was inequality on a large spectrum, when it came to payment in the war, tribal people actually were paid the same as white soldiers. And a lot of men seen this as a way to take care of their families, just as many soldiers do to this very day. And there's a political and social implications to be had from joining the Union Army. Again, we're looking for having new treaties agreed upon. We're looking at having citizenship, equality across the board. But also there was the Indian Wars in the West. And this is just my theory, my hypothesis about why some of the men of Company K were joining, because of the violence that was occurring to tribes west of the Mississippi. So in 1862, we had what we call the Lakota Uprising, and this was in Minnesota. This is after the Civil War breaks out, and there's a great deal of unrest between the Lakota, also known as the Sioux, and Minnesota, largely over land and resources. And they have what we call the Lakota War. And in 1862, this war is essentially ended with the capture of over 300 Lakota warriors. And the governor of Minnesota at the time wanted to execute all of those warriors. And he sent word to Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln responded back saying, do not execute these 300 individuals, pick 38 of them and have a mass execution. And this is the largest mass execution in US history. And this is over land, over resources. Men essentially were fighting to feed their families and have access to water and for hunting grounds. They were fighting over treaty rights. So this was right in our own backyard of the Great Lakes, and word spread very quickly that this was happening. So in my mind, individuals here in Michigan were paying attention to what was happening nationally. And if the US Army was going to capture hundreds of warriors and put them on trial and execute 38 of them over in Minnesota, could that happen in Michigan? And then later in 1864, we have one of the worst atrocities in US history with the Sand Creek Massacre. And volunteers under the Union Army attacked a peaceful Arapaho and Cheyenne village in Sand Creek, Colorado. It's one of the just absolute worst atrocities we had happen in the United States, where over 200 individuals were killed, the vast majority of them women and children and elderly, and just unspeakable barbaric actions committed upon these communities. And this was all under the Union Army. And again, word spread throughout Indian country, other tribes, that this happened. So what does it take to keep this happening from your communities? Again, this is my theory, my hypothesis about this, but you can't ignore the fact that these acts were being taken upon Native communities west of the Mississippi, and it had to have had some impact on the tribes east of the Mississippi on whether you join or you don't. So joining the Union, Natives were not allowed entry into the Union Army, and finally Natives were allowed entry into the Union Army in Michigan in 1863. And there's a lot of Anishnaabek leaders who helped organize others to join. They were the ones who are going to their communities and saying that this is a good fight, we need to do this, getting men to these mustering areas to enroll and enlist. And major areas were Detroit, Mackinac, and Isabella, where Anishnaabek would join. But public opinion was not always favorable of the Anishnaabek during this time period. So this is one of the leaders of Company K. He's the only Native officer in the company, and his name is Garrett Graverette. He is from Mackinac. He is Odawa, Ojibway, and German. He is quite the story. He is from a well-to-do family at the Mackinac area, a merchant family who had a business that was thriving at the time and doing trade. His father was non-Native, his mother was Native, and Garrett was actually a school teacher at Little Traverse, also known as Harbor Springs, where he taught music. So he essentially did not have to join. He was well taken care of, but he did. And when he joined, his father joined with him, Henry. He wanted to be with his son. Henry was a bit on the older side, but they still admitted him to go and fight. And Garrett would be the only Native officer in Company K, and he was instrumental in having other men join, but he was also instrumental in being a translator, because mind you, in the 1860s, the majority of Anishnaabek in Michigan, their primary language was Anishinaabe, our native language. Some did speak English, but it was their second. Some had very broken English, but Garrett was fluent in English and Anishinaabe, so he was able to translate fluently with his brethren and his kin who fought for the Union. And this is some of the public opinion I was talking about that was unfavorable, and this is from the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune. So in 1861, it says, a project was started in the legislature at Lansing last week, which was very fortunately nipped in the bud, for arming and equipping a regiment of Indians at the expense of the state to be used in the war. Every man knows the system of warfare adopted by these demi-savages, and the civilized people of the northern states will hardly consent this year to become responsible for the performance of such allies. All these projects are employing either Indian or Negro troops cannot be too strongly reprobated, and their authors cannot be subjugated to too great a degree of public scorn. So this is a major newspaper in the state of Michigan, and this is the opinion that they're putting out of Native soldiers, or natives overall. And this will not change, and then 2 years later, as a race, they, the Indians, have not yet reached that degree of civilization which should entitle them to all the rights and place on them all the responsibilities of citizenship. Very few of them can read, any by far the greater portion neither speak nor understand our language. At best, they are but semi-civilized. They are a poor, ignorant, and dependent race. So this is pretty blunt opinion. They're not mincing words how they feel about the native populations, yet through all of this pushback, Company K still fights to join the Union Army. And this is some opinion from the tribes themselves. This is Chief, bear with me, Nucky Chikwafami, a Saginaw Chippewa, who gave a rousing speech in Detroit in 1863 of the warriors heading into battle. We are the descendants of braves who, united with our younger brother, the Odawa, drove the powerful tribes now beyond the great river from these our once beautiful hunting grounds. And the chief went on to say, if the South conquers you, you'll be slaves, dogs. There will be no protection for us. We shall be driven from our homes, our lands, and the graves of our friends. So there was some fear that if the South did win, that they would subjugate the native populations to be slaves and also drive them out of their lands. So Company K joined, they enlisted, and they were not idle participants in the war itself. They fought, and they fought in some of the bloodiest battles. And doing my deeper dive into Civil War history, putting this story together, I just didn't realize just the large number of dead that were at these battles for the Civil War. It's like the 7 Days Battle, 36,000. Gettysburg, 34,000. And then in Spotsylvania, 31,000. Battle of the Wilderness, 28,000. And at Spotsylvania Wilderness, this is Company K did see heavy action. There were sharpshooters, the first Michigan Sharpshooters. And so this means that they were skirmishers. They were some of the first into battle. They were engaging the enemy before anybody else. And then they fought at the Siege of Petersburg. And Petersburg was one of the last battles of the war, one of the turning points of the war. And they fought at the infamous crater. Now, many Civil War buffs, they are very familiar with this story. I wasn't at first, and then digging deeper into the story, it's just one of the tragedies of the war. It just, once you read about it, it's like, why did that happen? And the mismanagement and leadership that took place in this. But long story short, Company K is there. They make it all through Spotsylvania and the wilderness. They end up at Petersburg. The North and the South are staring at each other over this great field for months on end. And the Union devises this plan to break up the stalemate, that they'll tunnel underneath the ground and pack explosives underneath the Confederate line and blow them literally up, blow them out of submission. And they do this. They get men from Pennsylvania who are miners, and they tunnel underneath until they reach the Confederate line. They pack it full of dynamite, literally tons of dynamite, and they light the fuse. And the explosion is horrific. It's just this massive explosion, takes the Confederates off guard naturally, but through mismanagement and poor leadership, the Union doesn't take advantage of this. And they give the Confederates time to regroup. And by the time the Union is sending in their forces, they're sending many men into the crater, into this large hole to fight. It's just a horrible decision. They send many African-American soldiers from New York, and they send Company K into this massive hole, and it becomes literally a turkey shoot for the Confederates. They have the high ground, and they just literally lay waste to the men who are in the crater. And in the crater, there are Anishnaabek from Company K. And there are accounts on both sides, Confederate and Union, of these Indians who are fighting in the pit, in the crater. And during the melee and the chaos, both sides take note that a group of Indians are huddled together and they pull their blouses, their shirts over their heads, and they start to sing their death song. They call it their death chant. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're singing their warrior song, their warrior death song, because they knew they weren't going to make it out. So they are doing what their ancestors had done for many, many generations before, and they're preparing to travel on. And one of the men that was in the crater, who is an Odawa by the name of Antoine Scott, he sees what's going on. He knows what's going on. And he is one of the last men to leave the crater because he is providing covering fire so his comrades can leave safely. And Antoine Scott is recommended for the Medal of Honor not once, but twice during the war. And one of those mentions for the Medal of Honor is because of what he did at the crater. So the men who went there, many of them didn't leave the crater. And I did have a chance to go and pay my respects at the grounds several years ago for the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Got to walk the grounds of where my ancestors were, go into the crater. It's not as large as it was when the event occurred, but just to read the records of what they went through, where the blood was several inches deep in the crater, and just how these men were singing. It was a pretty powerful moment for myself personally, and to be in that spot. But Antoine has to be mentioned because of his heroics and what he did at the crater. But some of the men, their story would not end with the crater. They were captured and they were sent to the infamous Andersonville Confederate prison camp down in Andersonville, Georgia, Camp Sumter. So men were captured out of the crater and they were sent to Andersonville. And Andersonville was just one of the most terrible spots in the whole Civil War. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers captured, sent there, were subject to just absolutely horrendous conditions with rotten food, exposure to the elements, sickness, and a lot of violence among the Union's captives themselves. And Company K was subjected to this. They were captured, sent into Andersonville, and harassed by other captives there who were Union soldiers. They seen these, what they call these savages, these Indians in the camp. They started to harass them for their goods, their possessions, whether it's clothing, shoes, blankets, and they fought back. They fought back against these aggressors, fought them off, and they were bothered no more. And some of them didn't make it back. A few of them died at Andersonville, and that's where they are interred to this very day. But several of them did survive the horrors of Andersonville. And so some of the key warriors who fought for Company K, Daniel McKeownagh, he is noted to have killed 32 rebels, many of them officers at the Wilderness. He died from his wounds at the battle, and is noted from some newspaper clippings of the day that he was shot several times but kept fighting. But he was also a bona fide chief of the Odawa from northern Michigan. And he is from what we call Mukwazibing, Bear Creek, known today as Petoskey. And he was a signatory for the 1855 Treaty of Detroit. And this treaty essentially kept us from being removed to Kansas or Oklahoma. So Daniel was one of the few recognized chiefs of the entire Union, and his actions went beyond signing the treaty that kept us from being removed, but he actually went and fought in the Civil War. And of course, we just mentioned Antoine Scott. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor not once, but twice. He never received his medals, and there's still, a drive to have Antoine receive his honors. So this is Payson Wolf. He is one of the only men who is photographed from Company K, and this is while he was on Company K's first detail at Camp Douglas in Chicago, watching some Confederate soldiers while they were being captives. And Payson Wolf is a very interesting story. He is from the Grand Traverse area. His uncle was Chief Peter Wakazu, and Payson married the daughter of the local Reverend George Smith and fought at Company K, obviously, was captured at Andersonville and survived Andersonville and returned back home to northern Michigan. And he is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Cross Village. So as I was saying, these personal connections to myself personally, I pay my respects to Payson every year during the fall months, where local Odawas here, we have what we call ghost suppers. And these ghost suppers are community events where we honor and feed our dead. We also go and take care of the graves of our ancestors. So I make a point to certainly go to Cross Village and paint Payson's cross, put a new flowers on, so on and so forth, to pay my respects. This is the only known photo of Company K in the field. We believe this at the Battle of the Wilderness. And the guy right in the middle here standing, we believe, not quite certain, that he's called Big Tom. And Big Tom was Ojibway Chippewa from the Isabella area. And from the accounts, he was sort of the muscle of the company. He kept guys in line, made sure things ran smoothly. So if Garrett needed somebody to help him keep order, he would go call on Big Tom. And Big Tom did survive and return back home to central Michigan after the war. And this is another home connection for myself. This is Francis Tabash, and he is from Cross Village. This is his home upon returning in Cross Village. He was captain in the GAR, the local GAR here in northern Michigan at Cross Village. And this is his wife to the left and his daughter to the right. And Francis is buried at Holy Cross with Payson. And the Michigan Historical Center actually has a quilt that was made by Francis's daughter as part of their artifacts on the Civil War. So there's a direct connection to Cross Village in the Civil War and the Odawa at the Michigan Historical Center. But this is Francis. And he, as I said, was from Cross Village and returned to Cross Village after the war, where he was a carpenter and a farmer. This is an unknown soldier of Company K. We just know him as soldier of Company K. He could be Odawa, he could be Ojibway. The photo's in a little bit rough shape, but it's one of the few images we have of men from Company K. This is John Showman. The Showman family is a very large Odawa family from northern Michigan, both at Grand Traverse and Little Traverse tribes. And John is buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Harbor Springs, Michigan. So Company K fought in some of the bloodiest battles, some of the worst battles of the war. And before I get too farther, there's one story of Company K where the men, they fought at the Siege of Petersburg. They get captured at Andersonville. They survive Andersonville. And two of those individuals that survive Andersonville are scheduled to return home on the Sultana, this large ship is the largest maritime disaster in United States history. So the Sultana is grossly overcrowded. It blows up out of Memphis, Tennessee. Hundreds of individuals die in this horrific maritime disaster. And two of those men who are on the Sultana were in Andersonville. They're part of Company K, but they survived the Sultana disaster and eventually make their way back home to northern Michigan. One is from Charlevoix and one is from Burt Lake. And the story of Burt Lake is a tragic story. The Company K men come back home, but they don't receive a hero's welcome. They go back into many of the battles that they are facing before the war. So for example, land and being disenfranchised from your land. So the Burt Lake Band of Odawa Indians are actually burned out of their settlement in 1900 by a land speculator and local sheriff. A land speculator goes and buys this community of about 400 acres. There's about 30 families living on this piece of land. The Odawa Burt Lake believe this is a reserve. They don't have to pay taxes, and it goes up for taxes. He buys the land, and he gets backing from the Sheboygan County Sheriff at the time to evict all of the Odawa. They protest this, but what can they do? The sheriff is there with a posse and they remove them by force, and then they proceed to burn all of their houses to the ground. And these communities have to walk to kin who are living about 30 miles away at Cross Village and Middle Village. And one of these individuals, families fought in Company K. And Civil War veterans who are not Native return back home and they squat on Indian lands in northern Michigan. Michigan is the fastest growing state in the Union in the 1850s, and land becomes very precious. It's at a premium, and a lot of Civil War veterans are promised land after the war, and some of these lands that are only available are Native lands. Many Company K veterans fight to have their pensions honored, and again, there isn't a hero's welcome when they come back home. So that is a quick story of Company K, and I'm very happy to share that story. And if you have any further questions, please contact Doug and the Kenosha Museum.
Thanks, Eric. Do you have time for me to just ask a quick question of you?
Absolutely.
You mentioned a couple of the men, Payson Wolf and Francis Tabash, that came back to Cross Village, and they're buried at Holy Cross Cemetery. Do you know, did these men join the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR organization? That was the main Union Army veterans organization. It looked like on that one photograph that the individual had like a GAR ribbon on his coat, and it made me think of that question. Do you have any evidence of that, or any writings from after the war?
Yeah, Francis was one of the officers for the GIR in northern Michigan. Yeah, so he was certainly involved. I believe Payson was also involved as well.
Great. Yeah, I kind of thought of that when I saw the image, that I thought he might have been a member there, with where you see so many of the Union veterans post-war proudly displaying those GAR ribbons, showing their membership in, just family photographs after the war, and it certainly looked like that to me. So that's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing it with us. And everyone, as you watch Eric's program, if there are questions, you can post them to the Facebook page, and I'll be certainly to get them to Eric and for feedback. And we want to thank him for taking his time and sharing the story with us today.
My pleasure.